The light in Aura was designed to forgive. It was a soft, honeyed glow that dripped from constellations of recessed fixtures, pooling on tables of polished obsidian and glinting off crystal so fine it seemed to hum. It was a light that smoothed the lines of age from the faces of Manhattan's titans and softened the predatory glint in the eyes of their heirs. It was a light that made everything and everyone look impossibly expensive. But for Clara Evans, standing on the periphery in her starched black uniform, the light was an interrogator. It found the tiny fray on her cuff, the faint scuff on her sensible shoes, and the deep, bone-weary exhaustion etched beneath her carefully applied concealer. At 24, she felt ancient. "Table 7, Evans, and look alive. That's Mr. Croft." The voice belonged to Mateo, the restaurant's manager, a man whose spine seemed to be forged from the same steel as the Michelin stars he coveted. Clara nodded, her stomach twisting into a familiar knot of anxiety and resentment. Julian Croft. The name was less a name and more a weather event in New York City. He was the architect of a private equity empire so vast it was rumored he could shift global markets with a single phone call. Tonight, he was dining with his fiancée, Victoria Sterling, a woman whose photograph was a permanent fixture on the society pages, always looking impeccably sculpted and glacially serene. Clara smoothed her apron, took a deep, steadying breath that did nothing to steady her, and approached the table. The air around it seemed to shimmer with its own gravitational pull. "Good evening, Mr. Croft, Mrs. Sterling. My name is Clara, and I'll be your server this evening. May I start you with some water? We have a wonderful volcanic spring water from just Pellegrino, and a bottle of the 96 Krug. Don't decant it," Victoria Sterling cut in, her voice as crisp as a freshly minted $100 bill. She hadn't looked at Clara. Her gaze was fixed on the diamond bracelet she was adjusting, a river of light that cost more than Clara's entire life. Julian Croft didn't look up either. He was scrolling through something on a phone so thin it looked like a shard of polished night. The cuff of his bespoke suit was slightly pushed back, and there, on the sinewy plane of his wrist, was the tattoo. Clara's heart didn't just pound. It slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was an involuntary, violent reaction. Her hand, holding the leather-bound menus, trembled. She had seen that design 1,000 times, but only in the faded ink on her mother's wrist and in the dozens of meticulous sketches she'd made of it in her own private notebooks. It wasn't just a simple design. It was a complex, interlocking symbol she had spent years trying to decipher as part of her abandoned art history studies. A Celtic lover's knot, impossibly intricate, was woven through an Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, the symbol of eternity. And woven within the serpent scales were nearly invisible pinpricks of blue ink, forming the constellation Lyra as it would have appeared in the summer sky over New York. Below it, a single date, June 14th, 1998. Her mother, Amelia, would trace it with a fingertip when she thought Clara wasn't looking, a sad, faraway look in her eyes. "It's from another life, sweet girl," she would always say, her voice thick with a past Clara could never access. "When I believed in forever." Now that forever was sitting 3 feet away from her, a man of 46 who looked like he'd been carved from granite and ambition, utterly oblivious to the fact that the architecture of his past was about to come crashing down. "The champagne, please," Julian Croft said, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention without needing to raise its volume. He finally glanced up, his eyes a startling shade of gray, like a storm front moving in over the Atlantic. They swept over Clara, registering her not as a person, but as a function, an obstacle between him and his champagne. Then he went back to his phone. Clara felt a dizzying surge of vertigo. The hushed murmur of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in her ears. For 5 years, she had been working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, ever since her mother's health had begun its slow, terrifying decline. She had dropped out of her scholarship program at Columbia, trading her dream of art restoration for the brutal calculus of survival. Rent, utilities, the mountain of medical bills for the tests they couldn't afford, the specialists who wouldn't see them without upfront payment. Every dollar she earned was a tiny sandbag against a rising flood. And this man, this stranger with her mother's forever etched on his skin, was ordering a bottle of wine that could cover a month of Amelia's medication. A white-hot rage, pure and potent, burned through the fog of her shock. It was an anger she hadn't let herself feel for years, a fury at the sheer, cosmic unfairness of it all. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the years, the lost years, the struggle. Her mother's hollow cough that echoed in their tiny Queens apartment, a sound that was the soundtrack to Clara's deepest fears. Victoria Sterling clicked her tongue, a sound of pure impatience. Is there a problem? The champagne isn't going to pour itself. Clara's training, the years of smiling through condescension and swallowing insults kicked in. Of course, Miss Sterling, right away. She retreated to the service station, her body moving on autopilot. Her mind was a maelstrom. It couldn't be a coincidence. The design was too specific, too personal. Clara knew from her studies that this particular variation of the lover's knot was incredibly rare, almost a signature. And Lyra, her mother, loved the stars. She had taught Clara the constellations as a child, pointing them out from their fire escape. Mateo intercepted her near the wine cellar. What's wrong with you, Evans? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, she lied, her voice tight. He narrowed his eyes. Don't mess this up. Croft is on the board of the company that owns this building. His opinion matters. She returned with the champagne, her hand surprisingly steady as she presented the bottle. The ritual was second nature. The pop of the cork, the careful pour. As she leaned in to fill Julian's flute, she saw it again, closer this time. The ink was dark, the lines sharp, not faded like her mother's. This was the tattoo of a man who could afford to have it touched up, to keep the past pristine. You're crowding me, Victoria said, shifting her chair an inch away as if Clara were contagious. Some people just have no sense of personal space. Julian Croft didn't seem to notice. He was speaking into his phone now, his voice low and clipped. Liquidate the position. All of it. I don't care what the projections say. My gut says it's a bubble. Now. He ended the call and finally took the champagne flute. His eyes for a second met Clara's. There was nothing there. No recognition, just dismissal. And something inside Clara snapped. The years of being invisible, of being treated as less than human, of watching her mother waste away while men like this reshaped the world for their own benefit. It all coalesced into a single, reckless impulse. She had to know. Sir? Her voice was quiet, but it cut through their bubble of wealth and privilege. Victoria sighed dramatically. What is it now? If you're looking for a bigger tip, that's not the way to get it. Clara ignored her. Her focus was entirely on Julian. Excuse me, Mr. Croft. I'm so sorry to interrupt. He raised a single eyebrow, a gesture of mild annoyance. Yes? I couldn't help but notice your tattoo. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the point of no return. Victoria let out a short, derisive laugh. Oh, for heaven's sake, are you hitting on him? How utterly predictable. Julian's expression hardened. A mask of cold indifference slid into place. I'm not interested. No, it's not that, Clara pressed on, her voice gaining strength from the sheer adrenaline of the moment. It's just, the design is very specific. He looked down at his wrist as if seeing it for the first time in years. It's a personal matter. This was her chance, her one and only chance. She had to prove this wasn't a guess, not a scam. She had to use the one thing she had left from her old life, her knowledge. It is, she agreed, her voice now clear and steady. It's not just a knot. It's a variant of the Savoy knot representing unending loyalty, but it's woven through an Ouroboros, which is unusual. The serpent's body contains the star pattern for the constellation Lyra, as it would have appeared in the Northern Hemisphere on the night of June 14, 1998. The style is reminiscent of late 20th century revivalist tattoo art, but the line work is exceptionally fine for that period. She took a breath. My mother has the exact same one. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked all the sound out of the room. The clinking of cutlery, the low hum of conversation, the distant city traffic, it all vanished. Victoria Sterling's smug smirk froze, then melted into confusion. Julian Croft's face, which had been a mask of bored authority, was suddenly, shockingly stripped bare. Every trace of color drained from it. His gray eyes widened, the pupils dilating. He didn't look at her with suspicion. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated shock, as if she had just spoken a language only the two of them could possibly understand. What? What did you just say? His voice was a raw whisper, barely audible, yet it echoed in the profound silence. Clara's resolve hardened. She had his attention now. My mother, her name is Amelia Evans. She went to Columbia University. She told me she got that tattoo with someone she loved, someone who was going to change the world. But he disappeared from her life. The champagne flute in Julian Croft's hand began to tremble. A single perfect drop of gold liquid trembled on the rim, then fell. He wasn't breathing. He was staring at her, but his gaze was distant, looking back across a quarter-century of ruthless ambition and buried regret. Amelia, he breathed her name. It sounded like an artifact excavated from a forgotten tomb. Victoria, finally grasping the gravity of the situation, found her voice. Julian, what is this? This is obviously some kind of pathetic shakedown. A waitress sees a rich man's tattoo and cooks up some sob story. It's disgusting. Security. But Julian didn't hear her. His eyes were locked on Clara's, and in their stormy depths, she saw a desperate, terrified question forming. And then the champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It didn't just break. It exploded against the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot, a sharp, violent report that made every head in the restaurant whip toward their table. Shards of crystal sprayed across the floor, glittering like fallen stars in a pool of golden champagne. That's not possible, Julian said, his voice ragged. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the stone. Amelia. I looked for her. Her roommate said she'd moved back to Ohio. She told me she lost the baby. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The rage that had propelled her was suddenly replaced by a cold, aching sorrow. She didn't lose the baby, sir. She couldn't go through with it. She ran because she was afraid. She told me your family, that they made it clear she wasn't welcome. Tears she hadn't realized were forming began to trace hot paths down her cheeks. She didn't lose the baby. She had me. She took a final shuddering breath and delivered the killing blow. Sir, I'm 24 years old. The silence returned, heavier this time, freighted with the weight of a life unknown, a secret held for a quarter of a century. Victoria stared, her mouth agape, the color draining from her own perfectly made-up face. She saw her future, her empire, her status, all flickering like a candle in a hurricane. Julian Croft staggered, one hand gripping the edge of the table for support. He looked at Clara, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the shape of her jaw, the stubborn set of her chin, the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. He saw Amelia's eyes staring back at him from a younger face, filled with a pain he had authored. A daughter, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. I have a daughter. The world he had so meticulously built, a fortress of wealth and power designed to protect him from the ghosts of his past, had just been leveled by a 24-year-old waitress in a restaurant he technically owned. And in the ruins, all he could do was stare at the ghost who had just walked back into his life. The ride to Queens was a study in surreal silence. Julian's driver, a stoic man named Thomas, who had likely witnessed countless corporate and personal meltdowns, navigated the gleaming black Maybach through the city streets with practiced indifference. In the back, the tension was a physical presence, a third passenger pressing in on them. Victoria was gone. After a brief, venomous exchange with Julian at the restaurant entrance, hissed accusations of a gold-digging tramp, and Julian's terse, final, "Get out of my sight, Victoria." She had hailed a cab, her glacial composure finally shattering into a million furious pieces. Now it was just Julian and Clara. He sat pressed against his door, staring out at the city lights as they morphed from the architectural jewels of Midtown to the gritty, vibrant chaos of the outer boroughs. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the restaurant, his face a mask of shock and a dawning horror that seemed to deepen with every block they traveled away from his world and deeper into hers. Clara sat opposite him, perched on the edge of the plush leather seat. She felt like an imposter in this silent, opulent cocoon. The scent of expensive leather and subtle, clean cologne was overwhelming after the smells of kitchen grease and disinfectant that usually clung to her. She watched Julian, studying the man who was, impossibly, her father. She saw the fine lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hand, resting on his knee, was clenched into a tight fist. This wasn't the triumphant billionaire from magazine covers. This was a man drowning. As the car turned onto her street, a block of pre-war walk-ups with flickering streetlights and bodegas glowing on the corners, he finally spoke. His voice was hoarse. Why now? After all this time? Why say something tonight? The question was sharp, laced with a thread of suspicion she had been expecting. He was a man who lived in a world of angles and agendas. Altruism was a foreign currency. Because my mother is sick, Clara said, her own voice flat and devoid of emotion. She was too tired for anything else. She's been sick for years and it's getting worse. Because we can't afford the specialist she needs to see, and the clinic in our neighborhood keeps telling us it's just a persistent cough. Because I work 70 hours a week and I'm still watching her fade away. I saw your tattoo, and I saw a chance. Not for me. For her. He flinched, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Sick? How sick? She can barely get out of bed some days. She's lost so much weight. The cough. Clara's voice broke. It never stops. The Maybach glided to a stop in front of her building. It looked like a spaceship that had landed on the wrong planet, its polished black exterior alien against the graffiti-tagged brick and peeling paint of the facade. Julian stared up at the building, at the row of dark windows, and Clara saw a profound, gut-wrenching guilt settle over his features. This was real. The consequences of his past weren't an abstract concept anymore. They were a 5-story walk-up in Queens. 5th floor, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The elevator has been broken since 2018. He didn't hesitate. Let's go. The climb up the stairs was an ascent through the layers of Clara's life. The smell of frying onions from the 2nd floor. The sound of a baby crying on the 3rd. The muffled bass of music from the 4th. Julian took the stairs 2 at a time, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place. He didn't seem to notice the chipped plaster or the worn linoleum. His focus was entirely on the door at the top. Clara's key trembled in the lock. She pushed the door open into the small, dimly lit apartment. It was clean, meticulously so, but there was no hiding the poverty. The worn sofa, the secondhand furniture, the stack of bills on the small kitchen counter. The air was thick with the scent of Vicks VapoRub and the sound that had been the backdrop to Clara's life for 2 years. A deep, rattling cough coming from behind a curtain that partitioned the living room. Clara, is that you, honey? You're home so late. The voice was weak, thin as paper. Amelia. Julian froze in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He looked like a giant who had stumbled into a doll's house. Clara stepped forward. Mom, I'm home, and I have someone with me. She pulled back the curtain. Amelia was propped up in bed against a pile of pillows, a worn paperback lying open on her lap. The years had not been kind. Her once vibrant auburn hair was streaked with gray, her face was gaunt, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. But even in the dim light, ravaged by illness and hardship, the ghost of the beautiful, laughing girl from Julian's memories was still there. Her eyes flickered from Clara to the tall figure standing in the shadows. For a moment, there was just confusion. Then, as Julian stepped fully into the light, her eyes widened in disbelief. The book slid from her lap and hit the floor with a soft thud. No, she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. It can't be. Julian? He took a hesitant step into the small space, his name on her lips undoing him completely. Amelia. The single word was freighted with 25 years of unspoken history. They stared at each other across the small room, a chasm of time and secrets separating them. He saw the vibrant, brilliant girl he had loved and abandoned, now frail and sick in a makeshift bedroom. She saw the ambitious, conflicted boy she had fled from, now a powerful man standing in the wreckage of the life she had built without him. Her gaze shot to Clara, her expression a mixture of terror and betrayal. Clara, What have you done? I had to, Mom, Clara pleaded, her voice thick with tears. He was there, at the restaurant. I saw the tattoo. I couldn't just walk away, not with you being so sick. You had no right. Amelia's voice was a raw, desperate cry. She tried to push herself up, a surge of adrenaline giving her strength. This was my choice, my life. You have no right to bring him here. Amelia, please, Julian started, taking another step forward. His hands were raised in a gesture of placation. I needed to see you, to know. Know what? She spat, the word turning into a racking cough that bent her double. Clara rushed to her side, rubbing her back as she struggled for breath. What is there to know, Julian? You made your choice a long time ago. You and your father. You gave me an envelope full of cash and told me to solve my problem. So I did. I solved it. She gestured weakly toward Clara. She is the solution. The accusation, so baldly stated, struck Julian with visible force. I was a child, he said, his voice ragged. I was 21 years old and a coward. My father, he threatened to destroy not just me, but you. He said he would make sure you never graduated, never got a job. I was terrified, and what I did was unforgivable. But you told me you miscarried. You let me believe our child was gone. To protect her, Amelia's voice rose to a pained shriek. To protect her from him, from you, from a world that would have seen her as a mistake, a liability on a balance sheet. I chose my daughter over your world, and I would do it again. I looked for you, he insisted, his voice cracking, for months. I went back to our apartment, to the university. You were just gone. If I had known, if I had any idea. What would you have done, Julian? Clara interjected, her voice cutting through their shared history like a shard of glass. She turned from her mother to face him, her eyes blazing. Would you have defied your father then? Given up the billions? Or would you have paid us off to stay quiet? To be a dirty little secret you could visit on weekends? The question hung in the air, brutal and unanswerable. Julian had no reply. The truth was, he didn't know. The man he was now was forged in the absence of that choice. He sank down onto the room's only chair, a rickety wooden thing that groaned under his weight. He buried his face in his hands. I don't know, he admitted, his voice muffled. God help me, I don't know. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a despair so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the room. But I know this. What I see here, your mother's health, this is my fault. All of it. He stood up, his demeanor shifting. The lost emotional man was gone, replaced by the decisive, commanding presence from the restaurant. Julian Croft, the problem solver. That ends tonight, he said, his voice firm. He pulled out his phone. I have the top pulmonologist in the country on my personal staff, Dr. Eris Thorne. He's the head of respiratory medicine at Mount Sinai. I'm calling him now. He'll meet you at the hospital tonight. No, Amelia said weakly. I don't want your money. We don't want your charity. This isn't charity, Julian stated, his gaze locking with hers. This is restitution. This is 25 years of backdated child support. This is every birthday, every Christmas, every school field trip I missed. This is the debt I owe and I will pay it. You will go to the hospital tonight. He wasn't asking. He was telling. He looked at Clara. You need to quit your jobs. Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. What? I can't just... You can, and you will. I'm transferring $500,000 into an account for you by morning. That will handle immediate expenses. We can arrange a proper trust later. You're going back to school. You're going to finish your degree in art history. You're going to have the life she sacrificed for you to have. It was all too much. The words, the money, the sheer force of his will, rearranging their lives in a matter of seconds. Clara felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. You can't just... She began, but the words died in her throat. I can, he said, his voice softer now, but with an undercurrent of steel. It's the one thing my money is good for. I can't buy back the years. I can't erase the pain. But I can fix this. Please, his voice broke again. a plea aimed at both of them. Please, let me fix this. Amelia looked from Julian's desperate, guilt-ridden face to her daughter's stunned expression. She looked around the tiny apartment that had been their sanctuary and their prison for so long. She felt the familiar rattle in her chest, the exhaustion that was her constant companion. And in that moment, her pride, the fierce, unyielding pride that had kept her going for 25 years, finally crumbled. She gave a slow, tired nod. Okay, Julian. Okay. The relief that flooded Julian's face was so immense, it was like watching a dam break. He finished his call, speaking in low, urgent tones. A car and a private medical team will be here in 15 minutes to transport you to the VIP wing at Mount Sinai. Dr. Thorne will be waiting. He hung up and looked at Clara. His expression was a complex mixture of hope and trepidation. This doesn't fix us, he said quietly. I know that. A DNA test will be required for the legal arrangements, a formality. But whatever that test says, I already know the truth. I see her in you. He took a step closer. I don't deserve to be your father, but I swear to you, starting tonight, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be. Clara didn't know what to say. The entire foundation of her world had been demolished and rebuilt in the span of 3 hours. As the distant wail of a siren grew closer, signaling the arrival of the life she never knew she was owed, she looked at the billionaire stranger who shared her DNA and felt only a vast, terrifying, and uncertain emptiness. The fight for survival was over. The fight for everything else was just beginning. The following weeks of or the weeks that followed were a symphony of muted beiges and hushed tones, a world so sterile and ordered, it felt like living inside a computer's dream. The private wing at Mount Sinai was a testament to what money could do. It could purchase silence. It could command views of Central Park turning to flame in the autumn sun. And it could bend the very fabric of time, compressing months of bureaucratic waiting into days of swift, decisive action. For Clara, who had spent her life in a world of sharp edges and loud noises, the quiet was the most jarring thing of all. It was a silence that left too much room for thought. She sat in a buttery leather armchair by her mother's window, a novel open but unread in her lap. The $500,000 Julian had spoken of was no longer an abstract concept. It was a real, terrifying number on a banking app on her phone. It was a dragon's hoard, an amount so obscene it felt like a clerical error. She had quit her jobs in 2 phone calls that felt like severing vestigial limbs. The manager at the diner had grunted a congratulations, assuming she'd won the lottery. Matteo at Aura had been icily silent, then had simply said, I see, and hung up. The gravitational pull of her old life, the constant grinding calculus of rent and bills and survival, was gone. In its place was a strange, terrifying weightlessness. She was an astronaut whose tether had been cut, floating in a sea of possibility with no idea how to swim. Julian was a ghost who materialized each evening after the markets closed, a specter in a Savile Row suit. He would enter Amelia's suite not with the command of a man who owned the building it was in, but with the hesitant trepidation of a boy approaching a hornet's nest. He never sat, not at first. He would stand near the door, a monolith of awkwardness, his hands clasped behind his back as if to prevent them from reaching for his phone, his lifeline to a world that made sense. The conversations between him and Amelia were like a verbal archaeological dig. They spoke in fragments, carefully unearthing shards of their shared past. Do you remember Professor Albright's Dante seminar? Amelia asked one evening, her voice still weak but clear. The man with the tobacco-stained beard, Julian replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He said my interpretation of the inferno was capitalistic sacrilege. It was, she'd said, and they shared a brief, fragile moment of laughter that shattered almost as soon as it formed, the silence rushing back in to fill the void, thick with the 25 years of unsaid things between them. With Clara, he was even more lost. He'd brought her a gift one day, a first-edition volume of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, bound in Moroccan leather. It was a beautiful, thoughtful object that would have been the centerpiece of her old life. Now it just felt like another expensive thing she was afraid to touch. Thank you, she'd said, her voice small. I had my research team look into your academic interests, he explained, as if presenting a quarterly report. Your thesis proposal was on the economic marginalization of female artists in the early 20th century. I thought it was appropriate. The clinical precision of it, the delegation of intimacy to a research team, was both heartbreaking and infuriating. He was trying to solve her, to understand her data points and purchase the correct corresponding emotional response. He didn't know how to simply see her. She was a problem on his balance sheet, and he was determined to bring the account into the black. The DNA test was a formality performed by a concierge doctor who took the swabs with unnerving cheerfulness. The results, Julian told them, would be back in a day. But the truth was already there, in the stubborn set of her jaw that mirrored his, in the way she would stare out the window, lost in thought, a habit he recognized with a jolt from his own reflection. He saw Amelia in the shape of her eyes and the kindness in her hands, but he saw himself in her spine of steel. It was a combination that terrified him. He had given her his ambition, his resilience, but he had forced her to forge it in the fires of a life he had run from. Dr. Eris Thorne delivered the diagnosis on a Tuesday morning, the sunlight streaming into the consultation room with an inappropriate sense of optimism. When he said the words, "It's not cancer," a strangled sob escaped Clara's throat, and she and Amelia clung to each other. The raw, animal relief, a physical force that left them shaking. Then came the condemnation. Q fever, a bacterial ghost, hiding in her mother's body for more than a decade, slowly, methodically shutting her down. A disease of poverty, Dr. Thorne had explained gently, often contracted from livestock, but also one that could lie dormant and flourish under conditions of extreme stress and malnutrition. It was an illness that could have been diagnosed and cured with a single, specific blood test and a course of antibiotics. A test that would have cost $2,000. $2,000, a rounding error for Julian Croft, less than he spent on a case of wine. That evening, Julian arrived after Dr. Thorne had left. Amelia was sleeping, a deep, healing sleep for the first time in years. Clara told him the news, her voice flat, reciting the facts as Thorne had given them. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking down at the endless river of headlights on Fifth Avenue. He was utterly still for a long time. When he finally turned, the mask of the stoic billionaire was gone. His face was a canvas of devastation, his gray eyes hollowed out, dark with a self-loathing so profound it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. "So," he said, his voice a ragged whisper that was somehow more terrible than a shout. "It wasn't a tragedy, it wasn't fate, it was a line item. You were dying because of a price point." He looked from the sleeping form of Amelia to Clara, his gaze unblinking. "I didn't just abandon you, I condemned you. I put a price on your life, and it was $2,000, and I chose not to pay it." He looked down at his own hands as if they were alien things, the hands that signed billion-dollar deals, that could shift markets, that could build empires. But they couldn't undo this. They couldn't rewind time. "Julian, stop," Clara said, though her own heart was aching with the brutal truth of his words. "We can't change it." "But I can," he said, a new chilling intensity in his voice. "I can change everything else." That night he asked her to walk with him in the hospital's rooftop garden, a manicured oasis of green in a concrete sky. The air was cold, smelling of city rain and distant wood smoke. "The results are official," he said, his voice clipped, businesslike again. A retreat to familiar territory. A 99% match. He didn't look at her. He looked at the distant spire of the Empire State Building. "My legal team is moving. You are now legally Clara Amelia Croft. Your name, should you choose to accept it. A trust, irrevocable and substantial, is being finalized. You are my primary heir, all of it. The holdings, the foundations, the estate." He spoke of the architecture of wealth, of corporate structures and tax shelters, of a world so complex and vast it made Clara's head spin. He was building her a fortress of gold, as if that could protect her from the ghosts of their past. "I don't care about the money," she said, her voice cutting through his monologue. She stopped beside a stone bench, forcing him to turn and face her. The city lights cast his face in sharp relief, all angles and shadows. "It is all I have to give you," he said, his voice raw. "It's the only tool I possess. It's my apology." "Is it?" she challenged, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Or is it a settlement? You pay us off. You fix the problem. You assuage your guilt, and then you can go back to your life. You stand in that room with my mother like you're visiting a stranger. You talk to me like I'm a hostile takeover you're trying to smooth over. Do you want a daughter, Julian? Or do you just want to clear your conscience before you die?" The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mouth opening and closing silently. For the first time since she'd met him, Julian Croft had no answer. The man who could command boardrooms with a single word was rendered speechless by a question about his own heart. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture one of pure desperation. "I don't know how," he finally whispered, the admission torn from him. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. "Clara, I don't know how. The language you are speaking, love, family, it's a language I never learned. In my world, love is leverage. Family is a dynasty, a series of obligations. I have spent 30 years building walls so high no one could ever get in. I don't know how to build a bridge." The immense crushing loneliness of the man radiated from him, a king in a gilded cage of his own making. "You could start," she said softly, her own anger melting into a strange, aching pity, "by sitting down. You could start by bringing a chair into the room instead of standing by the door like you're about to flee. You could ask her about me, about the 25 years you see as a blank space on a timeline. You could try to fill them in." She took a breath. "You could start by looking at me when you say my name." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, his storm gray eyes locking onto hers. And in their depths, she saw not a titan of industry, but a man drowning in regret, desperately reaching for a lifeline. "Okay," he breathed, the word a promise, a plea. "Okay, Clara, I'll try." It was, she thought, a start, and he did try. The next day he had a comfortable armchair brought into Amelia's room, and he sat in it. He didn't speak much, but he stayed. He listened as Amelia, her strength slowly returning, told him stories of Clara's childhood, of her first day of school, of her fierce loyalty to her friends, of her talent for drawing, a talent she had inherited from him. He listened, his face a mask of pained concentration, absorbing the details of the life that had run parallel to his own, a universe away. Clara, in the meantime, was building her own bridge back to a life she'd thought was lost forever. A personal call from the dean of Columbia University, a man whose name was on a building Julian had funded, had reinstated her scholarship, now expanded to cover all living expenses. She walked the campus paths, the weight of a canvas tote bag filled with books on her shoulder, feeling more real and more valuable than the millions in her bank account. It felt like coming home. Their fragile new reality, however, was built on a fault line, and the tremor came in the form of Victoria Sterling. Clara found her waiting in the hospital lobby, a marble statue of composed fury. She wore no jewelry, only a severe, impeccably tailored black dress. She looked like a woman attending a funeral. Perhaps, Clara thought, she was. They sat in the hospital cafe, an island of uncomfortable silence amidst the low hum of conversation. "I'm not here to apologize or to threaten," Victoria began, her voice a flat, polished monotone. "I'm here to present you with a reality you are too naive to comprehend. Julian is not a man. He is an ecosystem, an empire. Our marriage was not about love. It was a merger of two great houses, my family's political legacy and his financial power. It was a deal that would have consolidated our control over shipping, media, and technology for the next 50 years. "What does this have to me?" Clara asked, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. "Everything," Victoria said, leaning forward, her eyes like chips of ice. "You are not a daughter to him, not yet. You are an unforeseen event, a black swan. You are sentimentality, and sentiment is the one poison his empire cannot withstand. The partners I represent, the sovereign wealth funds, the old money dynasties, they do not invest in sentiment. They invest in ruthless predictability. You have made him unpredictable. You are a multi-billion-dollar liability. She slid a thin platinum case across the table. It opened with a silent click. Inside was not a checkbook, but a single embossed card and a sleek silver pen. That is a direct access card to a private Swiss account, Victoria said. The current balance is $50 million. Untraceable, tax-free. You take it. You and your mother move to Geneva or Paris or a private island in the Maldives. You build a new life, a wonderful life, and you never contact him again. You become a sad story, he tells himself, a ghost he has laid to rest. In return, I salvage our deal. Julian's empire is secured. Stability is restored. $50 million? The number was so absurd it had no meaning. Clara looked at the card, then at Victoria's perfectly composed face. She saw a woman who genuinely believed she was offering a solution, a clean, elegant transaction to fix a messy human problem. Victoria wasn't evil. She was simply a creature of a world where everything and everyone had a price. Clara thought of her mother upstairs, her laughter a little stronger each day. She thought of the registration form for her art history seminar sitting in her bag. She thought of Julian, sitting stiffly in an armchair, listening to a story about a lost tooth, his face a battleground of pain and wonder. It was a broken, scarred, and terribly complicated thing, this new life. But it was theirs. She gently closed the lid of the platinum case and pushed it back across the table. For 24 years, Clara said, her voice steady and clear, my mother and I survived on nothing. We had nothing but each other, and it was enough. You talk about deals and assets and liabilities. You see me as a variable that's costing you billions. She leaned in, her gaze meeting Victoria's. But I think you're calculating the equation incorrectly. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. You and your merger, you were the liability, Clara continued, the realization landing with the force of a revelation. You were a transaction, a deal that could be broken. I'm his blood. I am his past and his future. That doesn't make me a liability, Victoria. It makes me the only real asset he has left. You just don't have a column for it on your spreadsheet. She stood, leaving Victoria sitting alone with her box of impossible money. As Clara walked away, she felt not triumph, but a deep, resonant clarity. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was Clara Amelia Croft, and she was not for sale. When she told Julian what had happened, he didn't rage. He simply went still, a terrifying calm settling over him. He listened to the entire story without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, he closed his eyes for a moment. The deal, he said, his voice quiet, was contingent on my merging all my personal assets, including my primary voting shares, into the new joint entity. She was trying to buy you off to protect her stake. He opened his eyes and they were clear. The storm in them finally passed. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the transaction. He picked up his phone and made a single call. It's all, he said, his voice calm and absolute. All of it. Liquidate our positions with the Sterling Group. Yes, I'm aware of the kill fee. Pay it. We're done. He ended the call and looked at Clara. Some assets, he said, a faint, sad smile on his lips, are too valuable to leverage. That evening, the three of them were in the hospital room. Amelia was sitting up in the armchair, and Julian was showing her pictures of his estate in upstate New York on a tablet. There's a lake, he was saying, and a small studio by the water. It has perfect northern light. I had it built for, well, I don't know why I had it built, but I think you'd like it. Clara watched them, these two strangers who made up her entire history. The chasm between them was still there, vast and deep, littered with the wreckage of 25 years. But for the first time, she saw them beginning to build a bridge, a fragile structure woven from shared memories and hesitant hopes. Julian looked up and caught her eye. Clara, he said, and her name in his mouth no longer sounded foreign. Your mother was just telling me about the time you tried to paint a mural of the solar system on your bedroom wall with stolen nail polish. Amelia laughed, a real, full-throated laugh that made the monitors beside her beep contentedly. It was a masterpiece of cosmic horror, she said, Pluto was fuchsia. Julian smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes, erasing years of fatigue and loneliness. He looked from Amelia's laughing face to Clara's, and for the first time, he didn't look like a man drowning. He looked like a man who had, after a lifetime at sea, finally found shore. The world outside, with its mergers and markets, its deals and its deadlines, would continue to churn. There would be legal battles, society scandals, and endless complications. Their story was not over. But here, in this quiet, beige room, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines that measured life, the healing had begun. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning, purchased not with money, but with a currency far more rare, a second chance. And as the city lights began to sparkle in the dusk outside the window, Clara felt the vertigo finally subside, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful, and solid ground of home.